There's a photograph from 1943. British intelligence officers smiling. The caption celebrates their brilliance, cracking enemy codes. What it doesn't show? The hands that actually did the work. Hundreds of African recruits pulled from colonies, trained in secret, then buried in classified files for 80 years. They intercepted messages, broke ciphers, tracked enemy movements across 2 continents, and when the war ended, they were sent home with a single instruction: never speak of this. So they didn't, until the file started opening. Now we're learning just how much of the Allied victory depended on people history decided to forget, and why that decision was never about secrecy. It was about something far more deliberate.
November 18th, 1942. Kilindini Harbor, Mombasa, Kenya. The air is thick with salt and diesel fumes. Inside a nondescript colonial building overlooking the Indian Ocean, 3 African men sit hunched over a table covered in papers filled with seemingly random letters. Outside, British warships crowd the harbor, preparing for operations across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Inside this room, something far more valuable than ammunition is being produced: intelligence. Wafula Wanyama's fingers move across the coded message with practiced precision. He is 23 years old, educated at Alliance High School in Kikuyu, and fluent in 5 languages. Right now, he is translating an intercepted Italian naval transmission that British intelligence officers upstairs are waiting for, desperately. The message contains coordinates, convoy routes, supply ship movements heading toward Rommel's Africa Corps in North Africa. Wafula doesn't know it yet, but the intelligence he is processing will help sink 3 Axis supply vessels in the next 72 hours. Those vessels carry fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements that Rommel needs to push toward Cairo. Without them, the German commander's advance will stall. Montgomery will hold at El Alamein, and Wafula Wanyama's name will never appear in any official record of the battle. He is not alone. Across East Africa, dozens of African men are doing the same work. In Nairobi, signals intelligence operators monitor Axis communications across the entire Indian Ocean. In Dar es Salaam, African wireless operators intercept Japanese naval codes. In Cairo, African linguists translate captured documents from Italian, German, and Arabic. They were the invisible infrastructure of Allied intelligence in Africa and the Middle East. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. These weren't low-level assistants. These were trained cryptanalysts, signals intelligence specialists, and linguistic experts. Many had secondary education, rare in colonial Africa. Some were multilingual in ways British officers could never match. They spoke Swahili, Arabic, Italian, English, and local languages. They understood regional dialects, cultural contexts, and communication patterns that European codebreakers missed. They were essential, and they were erased. The official histories of World War II barely mention them. Bletchley Park gets the glory. Alan Turing becomes a household name. The Navajo code talkers earn their recognition. But the African code breakers who helped crack Axis communications across 2 continents? Silence. This is their story, the one that history forgot to write.
The recruitment started quietly in 1940. Britain was desperate. The war was spreading across multiple continents, and intelligence was becoming the most valuable weapon in the arsenal. But there was a problem. The empire was stretched thin.
Skilled personnel were needed everywhere at once: Europe, North Africa, Southeast Asia, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean. And Britain didn't have enough trained intelligence officers to cover it all. Someone in the War Office had an idea, a controversial one for its time. What if they recruited from the colonies? Not as soldiers, not as laborers, as intelligence operatives. The East African Command needed a signals intelligence network that could monitor Axis activity across the Indian Ocean and the Horn of Africa. Italian forces controlled Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland. German U-boats prowled the waters between Madagascar and India. Japanese submarines threatened Allied shipping routes to Burma and India. And Britain needed eyes and ears everywhere. Enter the East African Intelligence Corps. Officially, it was a small British unit. Unofficially, it was staffed predominantly by African personnel who did the actual intelligence work. The recruitment criteria were strict. Candidates needed secondary education, a rarity in colonial Africa where access to schooling was deliberately limited. They needed fluency in multiple languages. They needed to pass aptitude tests in mathematics, pattern recognition, and logical reasoning. The British were looking for brilliant minds, and they found them. Men like Samuel Ngugwi from Nairobi, who spoke English, Swahili, Kikuyu, and had taught himself Italian by reading confiscated newspapers. Like Ahmed Hassan from Mombasa, who could translate between Arabic, Swahili, and English with perfect fluency. Like Joseph Kambale from Uganda, who had a photographic memory and could spot patterns in coded transmissions faster than most trained cryptanalysts. These men were recruited into a world of secrecy. They signed documents they couldn't fully read, swearing oaths that bound them to silence for life. They were told their work was classified, that they could never speak of it, not to their families, not to their friends, not even after the war ended. And they never did. Most of them kept that promise until the day they died. The training was intense. British intelligence officers taught them the basics of signals intelligence, how to intercept radio transmissions, how to identify communication patterns, how to recognize coded messages. They learned about enemy communication protocols, cipher systems, and the art of traffic analysis. But here's what the British didn't anticipate. These African recruits brought skills that couldn't be taught. They understood the region in ways no European officer could. They knew the trade routes, the cultural networks, the patterns of movement across East Africa and the Indian Ocean. When an intercepted message mentioned a location by its local name, they didn't need to check a map. When a transmission used regional idioms or code phrases rooted in local languages, they caught it immediately. They weren't just translating words, they were translating worlds. By 1941, the East African Intelligence Network was operational. Listening posts stretched from Cairo to Cape Town. Interception stations in Mombasa, Nairobi, Kampala, and Dar es Salaam monitored Axis communications 24 hours a day. And at the heart of this network were African codebreakers whose names you've never heard. They were about to change the course of the war.
March 1941, Nairobi, Kenya. The intercept station is alive with the crackle of radio static. Headphones pressed tight against his ears, Samuel Ngugi listens to the rhythmic pulse of Morse code cutting through the interference. His hand moves across the paper, transcribing each signal group with mechanical precision. Dit da dit. Da da da. Dit dit da dit. He's tracking Italian military communications between Addis Ababa and Mogadishu. The Italians still hold parts of East Africa, and their radio operators are chattering constantly. Supply requests, troop movements, defensive positions. But Samuel Ngugi notices something else, a pattern. Every third day at precisely 0600 hours, a different type of transmission, shorter, more structured, higher priority. The message format is different, the call signs are different, and the content, even before decryption, feels different. He flags it for his supervisor, a British lieutenant who barely looks up from his tea. Probably routine, the officer mutters. Just log it. Samuel Ngugi logs it, and he keeps listening. 3 days later, the pattern repeats. Same time, same structure, same encryption signature. This time, Samuel doesn't ask permission. He starts building a traffic analysis chart. He maps the transmission times, frequencies, call signs, and message lengths. He cross-references them with intelligence reports about Italian military operations in the region. And he finds the connection. Every time this specific transmission occurs, Italian forces execute a major operation within 48 hours. Troop redeployments, supply convoys, defensive preparations. These aren't routine messages. These are operational orders being transmitted from Italian High Command in Rome to field commanders in East Africa. Samuel Ngugi brings his findings to the British intelligence officer. This time, the man pays attention. Within a week, the intercept station in Nairobi is prioritizing these transmissions. They are being sent to Cairo for decryption analysis. Some are forwarded to Bletchley Park, where the legendary British Codebreakers are working on Enigma and other Axis cipher systems. But here's the crucial detail that history forgot. The initial breakthrough came from Samuel Ngugi's traffic analysis, his pattern recognition, his understanding that something in the rhythm of these transmissions was different. He didn't break the code itself. The Italians were using a modified version of a cipher machine that required advanced cryptanalysis. But he identified which messages mattered, which transmissions were worth the effort of decryption. In intelligence work, that's half the battle. And across East Africa, other African code breakers were making similar breakthroughs. In Mombasa, Ahmed Hassan was tracking German U-boat communications in the Indian Ocean. The Germans were using variations of the Enigma machine, theoretically unbreakable. But Ahmed noticed that German radio operators were creatures of habit. They used similar message openings, repeated certain phrases, made predictable errors when transmitting weather reports. These were the cracks, the human weaknesses in an otherwise perfect system. Ahmed documented every pattern, every repeated phrase, every operator quirk. His reports went to British Naval Intelligence, where they were combined with decryption efforts from Bletchley Park. The result? By mid-1942, Allied forces were tracking German U-boat positions in the Indian Ocean with increasing accuracy. Convoys were being rerouted, ships were avoiding ambushes, supply lines to British forces in India and Burma remained open. Lives were being saved. And Ahmed Hassan's contribution remained classified for the next 80 years. This was the reality of signals intelligence in World War II. It wasn't just about breaking codes, it was about understanding communication patterns, identifying priority targets, recognizing anomalies, and building the contextual knowledge that made decryption possible. The African code breakers weren't working in isolation. They were part of a larger Allied intelligence network, but they were doing work that was absolutely essential. And they were doing it with fewer resources, less recognition, and under conditions that British officers would have considered unacceptable for themselves. They worked in sweltering intercept stations without proper ventilation. They pulled double shifts when personnel were short. They processed intelligence that saved thousands of lives. And when the war ended, they were told to forget everything they had done.
October 1942. Cairo, Egypt. The war in North Africa is reaching its climax. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, has pushed the Afrika Korps deep into Egypt. His forces are exhausted, undersupplied, but dangerously close to breaking through at El Alamein. If he succeeds, the Suez Canal falls. British control of the Middle East collapses. The entire Mediterranean theater could shift in Germany's favor. Everything depends on supply lines. Rommel needs fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, and those supplies have to cross the Mediterranean from Italy. The convoys are heavily defended. Italian warships, German aircraft, submarine escorts. But they are vulnerable. If the British can find them, they can sink them. And that's where signals intelligence becomes the war's decisive weapon. Inside a secure facility in Cairo, a team of intelligence analysts is working round the clock. Among them are 3 African linguists whose names never made it into official records. They are processing intercepted Italian naval communications, translating operational orders, and piecing together convoy schedules. One of these men is David Ochieng, a Kenyan analyst fluent in Italian. He's working on a transmission intercepted 2 days earlier, an encrypted message from Italian Naval Command in Taranto to convoy escorts in the Mediterranean. The message has already been partially decrypted by British cryptanalysts, but the decryption is incomplete. Fragments, code groups that don't quite make sense, geographic references that seem contradictory. This is where David's linguistic skill becomes critical. Italian military communications didn't just use cipher machines. They used operational codes, shorthand references, regional terminology, naval jargon that only made sense if you understood the language deeply. A British officer might decrypt the words but miss the meaning. David reads through the fragments. He recognizes a phrase, operazione speciale via sicura, special operation via safe route. He knows what that means. The Italians have been using this phrase to refer to high-priority convoys carrying critical supplies. And via sicura doesn't mean the route is actually safe. It's a code name for a specific shipping lane the Italians believe is less monitored by British forces. He cross-references the transmission with previous intercepts, dates, times, convoy designations, and he finds the pattern. The convoy is scheduled to depart Taranto on October 19th. It will carry fuel and ammunition destined for Rommel's forces. The route will take it through the central Mediterranean, passing near Malta. David's analysis goes up the chain of command. Within hours, it reaches British naval intelligence. Within a day, RAF reconnaissance aircraft are searching the coordinates David identified. They find the convoy exactly where he predicted. October 20th, 1942. British submarines and aircraft attack the Italian convoy. 3 supply ships are sunk. 2 others are damaged and forced to turn back. Thousands of tons of fuel that Rommel desperately needs, sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Rommel's offensive stalls. His tanks run out of fuel. His ammunition stocks dwindle. On November 2nd, 1942, British forces under Montgomery launch a counter-offensive at El Alamein. Rommel, undersupplied and outgunned, begins a retreat that won't stop until his forces are driven out of North Africa entirely. The Battle of El Alamein becomes one of the turning points of World War II. Churchill later calls it
the end of the beginning. Historians credit Montgomery's tactical brilliance, Allied material superiority, and Rommel's supply problems, but they don't mention David Ochieng or the dozens of other African intelligence analysts whose work helped strangle Rommel's supply lines. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout 1942 and 1943, African codebreakers and translators in Cairo, Nairobi, and Mombasa were processing hundreds of intercepted communications. They were identifying convoy routes, decoding supply schedules, and providing the intelligence that allowed Allied forces to dominate the Mediterranean. They were part of a larger intelligence operation, yes, but they were an essential part. The part that understood the languages, recognized the patterns, and connected the dots that others missed. And when the war ended, their files were sealed. Their contributions were classified. Their names were removed from the historical record. Because acknowledging their role would have required acknowledging something uncomfortable, that colonized Africans had been trusted with some of the war's most sensitive intelligence work, that they had performed brilliantly, that they had been indispensable. That narrative didn't fit the post-war world Britain was trying to build. So the story was buried.
June 1943, Mombasa, Kenya. The war in Europe dominates the headlines, but there's another theater where the outcome hangs in the balance: Burma. The Japanese Imperial Army has swept through Southeast Asia with brutal efficiency. British forces are retreating. Supply lines to China are cut, and the Japanese are threatening India itself. The Indian Ocean has become a strategic battleground. Japanese submarines are hunting Allied convoys. Surface raiders are attacking merchant ships carrying supplies to British forces in India. Intelligence is scarce. The Japanese are using complex cipher systems that are proving difficult to break. But there's a listening post in Mombasa that's picking up something interesting. Corporal James Mwangi sits in front of his radio receiver, headphones clamped over his ears. He is monitoring Japanese naval frequencies, transcribing Morse code transmissions that will be forwarded to British cryptoanalysts in Colombo and eventually to Allied codebreakers working on Japanese ciphers. James has been doing this work for 18 months. He's developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between different Japanese radio operators based on their Morse code rhythm, what intelligence officers call a fist. Every operator has a unique style, the way they tap the key, the spacing between letters, the small variations in timing. Tonight, James recognizes a fist he's been tracking for 3 months, an operator he's privately nicknamed Quick Tap because of his rapid, precise keying style. Quick Tap works on a Japanese submarine. James has confirmed this through traffic analysis and cross-referencing with British naval intelligence reports. The transmission is brief, coded, but James notes something unusual. The message is being sent to multiple recipients, a pattern that suggests operational coordination, multiple submarines preparing for a coordinated attack. He logs the transmission, marks it priority, sends it up the chain. 3 days later, British naval intelligence decrypts the message. It contains coordinates for a planned attack on an Allied convoy carrying reinforcements and supplies to India. The convoy's route, the timing, the submarine positions. The convoy is rerouted. The Japanese submarines find empty ocean. And James Mwandi's identification of the unusual transmission pattern gave Allied forces the critical 3-day warning they needed. But James's contribution goes deeper than single intercepts. Over months of monitoring Japanese naval communications, he's built a comprehensive database of Japanese radio operators, their call signs, their patterns, and their behavioral quirks.
He's created a FIST library, a reference guide that allows other intercept operators to quickly identify which submarine or ship is transmitting. This kind of traffic analysis is painstaking work. It requires concentration, pattern recognition, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. It's not as glamorous as breaking codes, but it's just as valuable. Because in signals intelligence, knowing who is talking to whom, even if you can't read the message, can tell you everything you need to know. James isn't alone in this work. Across East Africa, dozens of African wireless operators and intercept specialists are monitoring Japanese, German, and Italian communications. They are tracking ship movements, identifying communication networks, and building the intelligence picture that Allied commanders need to make decisions. In Dar es Salaam, operators are monitoring Japanese communications related to the Indian Ocean and Madagascar. In Nairobi, analysts are processing intelligence about Japanese diplomatic communications with Axis partners in the Middle East. In Kampala, intercept stations are tracking Axis communications across Central Africa. It's a vast network, and it's producing results. By late 1943, Allied forces have significantly improved their understanding of Japanese naval operations in the Indian Ocean. Convoy losses are decreasing. British submarines are scoring more kills against Japanese vessels. Supply lines to India and China are becoming more secure. This intelligence advantage contributes to the gradual Allied recovery in the Burma campaign. British and Commonwealth forces begin pushing back. The Japanese advance is halted, and by 1945, Burma is liberated. Military historians credit better tactics, improved logistics, and Allied material superiority. They don't mention the listening posts in East Africa. They don't mention the African intercept operators who spent thousands of hours monitoring enemy communications. They don't mention James Mwangi's FIST library or the traffic analysis that gave Allied forces their intelligence edge. Because those records were classified, and they stayed classified. After the war, James returned to Kenya. He never spoke about his wartime work. He couldn't. The Official Secret Act bound him to silence. His family knew he'd served in some capacity during the war, but they never knew what he actually did. He died in 1989. His obituary made no mention of his intelligence work, no mention of the convoys he helped save, no mention of the lives his work protected. Just another forgotten veteran. Another name that history lost.
May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the Allied world, celebrations erupt. In London, crowds flood the streets. In New York, ticker tape rains down from skyscrapers. In Moscow, artillery salutes thunder across Red Square. In Nairobi, Samuel Ngugi sits alone in his quarters, listening to the celebrations outside. He's been working in signals intelligence for 5 years. He's processed thousands of intercepted messages. He's contributed to operations that saved countless lives. And now it's over. A British officer arrives the next morning with paperwork, forms to sign, the Official Secret Act renewed and reinforced. Samuel reads through the dense legal language. The message is clear. Everything you did during the war is classified. You will never speak of it, not to your family, not to journalists, not to historians, not even to other veterans. This conversation never happened. This work never existed. You were never here. Samuel signs. What choice does he have? Across East Africa, the same scene plays out in dozens of locations. Intelligence operatives, African men who spent years doing critical work for the Allied war effort, are being systematically removed from the record. Their personnel files are sealed, their unit designations are classified, their names are redacted from operational reports. The intercept stations where they worked are dismantled or repurposed. The evidence of their contribution is being erased in real time.
Why? The official reason is security. Intelligence work is always classified, protecting sources and methods, standard procedure. But there's another reason, a more uncomfortable one. The British Empire is trying to maintain control over its African colonies, and that control depends on a carefully constructed narrative that Africans are not yet ready for self-governance, that they lack the education, the sophistication, the capacity for complex work. Acknowledging that African men had served as cryptanalysts, signals intelligence specialists, and linguistic experts, that they had been entrusted with some of the most sensitive secrets would undermine that narrative completely. How do you justify denying people political rights when you've just spent 5 years trusting them with military intelligence that determine the outcome of global conflicts? You don't, so you bury the evidence. The recognition goes elsewhere. Bletchley Park becomes famous. The British Codebreakers become legends. Books are written. Movies are made. Alan Turing's story, tragic and heroic, becomes part of popular culture. The American Navajo Code Talkers eventually receive recognition, congressional medals, public acknowledgement. Their story becomes a symbol of diverse American contribution to the war effort. But the African Codebreakers, nothing. No medals, no public acknowledgement, no monuments, no mention in official histories. In the 1950s and 1960s, as African nations begin fighting for independence, these veterans watch from the sidelines. They know what they contributed, they know what they are capable of, but they can't speak about it. Some try. In the 1970s, a Kenyan veteran attempted to publish his memoirs. He writes carefully, avoiding specific operational details, focusing on his general experience. British officials intervene. The manuscript is confiscated. He is threatened with prosecution under the Official Secret Act. The message is clear. Your story will not be told. By the 1990s, most of these veterans are elderly or deceased. Their children and grandchildren know vague details. Grandfather worked for the British during the war, but nothing specific. The institutional memory is fading. A few historians begin asking questions. They find references in declassified documents, footnotes mentioning local personnel or native auxiliaries in intelligence operations, but the details remain locked away. The full story stays hidden. It's not until the 2000s that some records begin to emerge. Researchers digging through British archives find fragments, intercept logs with African names, personnel rosters showing East African Intelligence Corps members, traffic analysis reports signed by men with Swahili and Kikuyu names. The evidence has been there all along, just buried, hidden, classified. And even now, with some records available, the story hasn't penetrated mainstream consciousness. The documentaries about World War II code-breaking still focus on Bletchley Park. The textbooks still omit African contributions. The narrative remains unchanged. Because changing the narrative means confronting uncomfortable truths about empire, about whose contributions get remembered, about whose genius gets acknowledged. It means admitting that history as it's been told is incomplete, that the heroes we celebrate are only part of the story, that there were other heroes, equally brilliant, equally essential, whose names we never learned. Samuel Ngugi died in 1998. His family held a small funeral in Nairobi. The obituary mentioned that he had served during the war but gave no details. David Ochieng died in 2003. His children knew he worked in Cairo during the war, but they didn't know about the convoy intercepts and the intelligence that helped win El Alamein. James Mwangi died in 1989. His grandchildren never knew about the Fist Library or the Japanese submarine intercepts. Ahmed Hassan died in 1995. His contribution to tracking German U-boats in the Indian Ocean died with him. One by one, the African codebreakers who helped win World War II passed away, and their stories passed with them. Until now.
2018, Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Wanjiru Kamau sits in the Kenyan National Archives, surrounded by dusty boxes of documents. She is a historian researching East African involvement in World War II. For months, she's been finding fragments, references to intelligence units, names that don't appear in British records, intercept station locations that official histories claim never existed. She's chasing ghosts. But today, she finds something concrete. A personnel roster from 1943, East African Intelligence Corps. 37 names, ranks, duty stations, and next to each name a notation. Signals Intelligence Specialist, or Cryptanalysis Assistant, or Linguistic Analyst. This is it. Physical proof that African codebreakers existed, that they weren't just support staff or manual laborers. They were trained intelligence operatives doing sophisticated work. Dr. Kamau photographs every page. She begins tracing the names. Some lead nowhere, records destroyed, families dispersed, memories lost. But she finds a few descendants, grandchildren who remember stories, children who kept their father's service documents. Slowly, painfully, she begins reconstructing the story. She's not alone. In recent years, a small community of historians and researchers across Africa and Britain have been piecing together this hidden history. They are finding intercept logs in British archives, personnel files that weren't destroyed, declassified intelligence reports that mention African analysts by name. The evidence is fragmentary, but it's there, and it tells a story that should have been told 70 years ago. African codebreakers were not peripheral to Allied intelligence operations. They were central to them. They provided linguistic expertise that British officers lacked. They understood regional contexts that made intelligence actionable. They recognized patterns and developed analytical methods that contributed directly to Allied victories. They helped strangle Rommel supply lines in North Africa. They tracked Axis submarines in the Indian Ocean. They monitored enemy communications across 2 continents. They saved lives. They changed outcomes. And they did it all while being paid less than their British counterparts, while being denied promotions that their skills warranted, while working under officers who often didn't recognize their contributions, while being bound to silence about their accomplishments. This is the reality of colonial intelligence work. Brilliant minds, essential contributions, systematic erasure. But here is what makes this story even more powerful. These men didn't do this work for recognition. They did it because it mattered, because stopping fascism mattered, because protecting lives mattered, because contributing to something larger than themselves mattered. Samuel Ngugi could have stayed silent about the communication patterns he discovered. David Ochieng could have done the minimum required of him instead of developing deep analytical expertise in Italian naval communications. James Ngwani could have been just another intercept operator instead of building a comprehensive database that enhanced Allied intelligence capabilities. They chose excellence. They chose contribution. They chose to use their brilliance to make a difference. And they did it knowing they might never be recognized. That's the definition of heroism. Today, there's a growing movement to recognize these forgotten veterans. In Kenya, historians are pushing for official acknowledgement. In Britain, researchers are petitioning for their names to be added to intelligence memorials. In Tanzania and Uganda, descendants are sharing their families' stories. It's slow work. Official recognition requires overcoming decades of institutional resistance. It requires Britain to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about colonial intelligence operations. It requires changing narratives that have been set in stone for generations. But it's happening. Because these stories deserve to be told, these names deserve to be remembered, these contributions deserve to be acknowledged. This is what Rise of African Nations stands for. Finding the stories that history buried, spotlighting the genius that was ignored, reclaiming the narratives that were stolen. African codebreakers helped win World War II.
not as footnotes, not as auxiliaries, as essential contributors whose intelligence work shaped the outcome of the war. They cracked communication patterns, they identified priority targets, they translated the intercepts that led to strategic victories. They worked tirelessly in the shadows while others took credit in the light. And now, finally, their story is being told. Samuel Ngugi, David Ochieng, James Ingwanyi, Ahmed Hassan, Wafula Wanyama, and dozens of others whose names are still being discovered in dusty archives and fading memories. These are the African heroes who history forgot. But we haven't forgotten, and we won't let their stories die in silence. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to history you never knew existed, hit that like button. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. Did you know about African codebreakers before this? Share this video so others can learn what the history books left out. Want to dive deeper? We've written a full blog post with sources, additional research, and photographs where available. Check the description below. And here's the most important part. Subscribe to Rise of African Nations. Your support means we can keep researching, keep uncovering, keep telling the stories that deserve to be heard. African genius, African brilliance, African contributions that changed the world. These stories matter, and we're just getting started. Subscribe, share, help us rise.